Welcome to a brand new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we have a very special guest. We have David Ost. He's an emeritus professor of politics at Hobart and William Smith Colleges, who's written widely on Eastern Europe, left and right politics, and labor and democracy. He's the author of Solidarity and the Politics of Anti-Politics, The Defeat of Solidarity, Anger in Politics in Post-Communist Europe, as well as editor and author of Class After Communism, and co-editor and author of Workers After Worker States. He has written for a wide variety of scholarly and public and popular publications, and his new book, available now, is called Red Pill Politics: Demystifying the Far Right from Fascism to Right-Wing Populism. David, it's such a pleasure to have you with us here today, and thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, I'm really happy to be here. Admire your show. I'm happy to be able to be on it.
I love it, comrade. And I want to really quickly say before we get into the passage, so David is a fellow New Yorker. That's going to come up at some point in our conversation. Okay, so he wrote in the book, the similarities of right-wing populism to the fascism of the 1930s appear obvious. Glorification of the quote-unquote nation, denigration and verbal exclusion from that nation of a wide variety of quote-unquote others, constant deployment of identity-based us versus them conflicts, demonization of opponents as quote-unquote traitors rather than opponents, contempt for liberal democracy. But do so the differences. The formal acceptance of democracy, refraining from outright physical violence against opponents, the absence of mass repression. So is this fascism? We can't appeal to the professional historians since even they have no agreement on the meaning of fascism. No universally accepted definition of the fascist phenomenon exists, writes one of the leading historians in the field. There's no consensus as to its range, its ideological origins, or the kinds of actions which characterize it. For the general public, Nazism is the very essence of fascism. Yet some scholars deny that Nazism was fascism on the grounds that it was too extreme or too different from the Italian model. Nor can we appeal to political actors, since the term's negative connotation ensures its continued deployment by RWP's opponents, while preventing RWP supporters from even considering it. The only way to proceed, then, is to change the question. Instead of asking whether one is like the other, let's ask, to what political species do both fascism and right-wing populism belong? So fantastic. And what I love about it so much is, and David, I'm sure you see this and this argument, or at least the question comes up with a lot of people, where people say something and they kind of mix up like fascism and socialism, where, and I want to actually start here because I think it's so important, where people would say, but wait, Nazis are socialists, right? So how are they fascists? That doesn't make any sense, right? So yeah, so let's kind of get into that, because I think the question of what is fascism, how do we see it, how do we differentiate between fascism and socialism, I think that comes up for a lot of people who kind of view totalitarianism, and they pretty much view totalitarianism as a monolith, and they pretty much throw all of these isms into it, right? And they say like, well, this is all the same stuff, but it's not. Why not?
Yeah, great questions. Look, I'm actually not surprised, but I'm still kind of stunned to hear that, to know that a lot of people confuse fascism and socialism. Now, it is, of course, true that the formal name of the Nazi Party was the German Workers. What was it? German Workers' National Socialist Party, right? So they used that term. And actually, as you know, I go into a section of this. The thing is, right, what we miss and what's really crucial to understanding both fascism and this right-wing populism today is that in many ways, right, they were also critical of capitalism. They were critical of capitalism from the right. When fascism came around, I say in the book, this was a political innovation on the part of the right. That beforehand in the 19th century, the right wing was like, the masses must be kept at bay, right? We can't include them at all. They have to be repressed. We can't let this democracy happen. And the fascists recognized that, gee, what's happening is that the masses are rising, industry is growing. That's what it means to have masses there, because people come from the villages into the cities. And the villages, they're not so much known or seen, and they don't pose a great threat to the politicians. When they're in the cities and they don't have enough to eat because they don't live on the land, then they protest, and then all that, right? And so the right wing was kind of like, what do? These masses are arising. So they came forth, right, and the fascists, and said, we have to do something for the masses, but we hate the left that's trying to do it, right? We're traditionalists, we're authoritarians, we're exclusionary nationalists, right? We don't want any of this liberal democracy stuff, right? But critical of capitalism, yes. Those of us who grow up in America know that historically, right, in our lifetime, even in my mother's lifetime, was born in 1928, the right were the modern capitalist right. And fascists emerged as those who were criticizing capitalism for screwing workers, but also screwing workers and driving them to the left, right? That's what they hated. And so for a while, right, in the early 20th century, most socialists were on the left, but socialism was a word that for a long time just meant critical of capitalism. And that's why the right was able to use it too. Now, in recent times, already in the 20th century, socialism was more and more a category of the left, except, of course, for that powerful example of the Nazis who kept using that term. Interestingly, few people know this, the Nazis never called themselves fascists. They didn't use that word. Fascism was an Italian word and used in Italy and then used by people to say, well, this kind of politics is going on everywhere. They always called themselves National Socialists, right? But all they wanted to do, they wanted to make sure workers didn't go to the left. So they were critical of the capitalists, even, Hitler and Mein Kampf, like you're driving the workers to the left by not even, like having protections for pregnant women workers. That's insane. We have to do that, right? So they provided these little things as like, paternalist authoritarians will give you a couple of things, but you're not going to be able to, do anything on your own. And socialists, of course, especially after World War II, you had social democracy arise in the West, you had state socialism in the East, and, particularly social democracy, that's an example of a movement that is working with workers, giving power to independent trade unions. You negotiate on your own, right? It's not just a paternalist system that we have these others. And that's socialism. It's that democracy. It's that, workers have full representation. They decided themselves who's going to get what kind of representation, what kind of demands we're going to put forth. Right. And we're going to try to make things better for people as a whole without that authoritarianism.
Something I'm very curious about is in regards to modern political movements, right? Like when we look at right-wing politics, a lot of people are very quick to call anyone on the right wing fascistic, right? You're a fascist, right? But I guess my question is, what do people kind of misunderstand about the rise of right-wing populism? Like, what do we lose by labeling it as fascist, for example?
Well, look, if you just label it as fascist, that tends to mean you're bad, you're very bad, and you're violent, right? So I've noticed in the last years, it's one of the reasons I, began with this quote that you began with, that when the violence is ratcheted up, particularly in America, but this happens in other countries too, and the violence is ratcheted up, then more people say, oh, this is now fascism, this is the real fascism, right? And then when it's down, it's like, oh, maybe it's not, maybe it's right-wing populism. And what I noticed, after doing this research on this is, right, as that quote says, their politics are very similar. Their aim, I mean, I use that term red pill, you probably get to this, but obviously that's his right-wing manosphere term, and I kind of troll that term by using it as an acronym to stand for the kind of politics that both represent. It's a mouthful, right? Right-wing, exclusionary, nationalist, democratic, populist, illiberalism. Again, who's going to remember that? Who's going to say all that? But if we understand it as a kind of politics, right, that I call red pill, then that's what today's populists want. right-wing populists, and that's what classic fascism did. So just calling them fascist, right, means they're bad, and what we've seen is that then people say, "Oh, who cares? Call me a fascist doesn't mean anything anymore," right? So so I say no. These things actually mean something, and this thing emerging now is so-called right-wing populism is as dangerous as classic fascism was, right? And that it doesn't take much for one to look like the other, right? And so I go through in the book some parts where, classic fascism under Mussolini and even Hitler, right? If you weren't an open oppositionist, and in Germany, of course, if you weren't a Jew, right, that life could be okay for you if you didn't protest, right? We're not repressing you all the time. We have music, we have entertainment, all those kinds of things can still happen, but it's completely repressive, and it follows all the elements of red pill politics, prevents any independent organizations from arising, always designates huge numbers of others as outside of our nation, as useless, as not worthy people. And that's what the so-called right-wing populism has been bringing back, right? That's why Trump was an innovation, right? The Republican Party in 2016 said, who is this guy? We have a litany of guys, whether it's Vance or who's that, Lindsey Graham, all of those things. They said, of course, this guy has nothing to do with it. He's scum of the earth and all that, right? Because he was bringing back that classic fascist rhetoric. But of course, what's also happened is that, fascism as a political movement was defeated in the World War II, right? And overnight, the term became a dirty word. So people had to start moving away from that. And the left became democratic socialist and provided things for working class people, for non-elites, to make them feel included. But in these last decades, as workers and non-elites say the system isn't working for us, then you get these guys, right? Then you get an opportunity for these right-wing populists to resurrect that red pill ideology of fascism. And it can go very violent, as Trump, as we saw in Minneapolis, or as we see now with these, detention centers around the country. I mean, sometimes, I feel like, we're talking, and that's good. We're not being formally repressed now. We can have this conversation.
Right.
Could change. That could change, right? And but it's partly like we're an Aryan person in Hitler's Germany, and they're just not repressing us right now, right? So I don't totally reject the category of fascism. I think it can still be used, but we got to know what it is, and to be able to identify it and to be able to challenge it. And so just saying the word isn't enough, right? And if we get how it is able to recruit people that have traditionally belonged to the left, then we can fight it. You might have cited this, but I have this line that many people see as like, what are you talking about? Very provocative, where I say in the beginning that we have to recognize that to understand it, fascism emerged as the left wing of the radical right.
Right.
Say, what the hell are you talking about? I mean, fascism is the furthest right you can go, right? But I say, well, not exactly. Well, it's very far right, authoritarian, brutal, oppressive, all that, right? But again, it says we're going to provide some things for workers, not just let them starve and get angry and drive them to the left. We're going to pose as some benefactors for them that the previous right didn't do. If you contrast it with someone like Pinochet, right, or even Franco, who were ruled as we're represented the traditional leader. We have to repress all workers. Fascism and right-wing populism like to bring them in. And that's the real danger, right? That we see, oh, they're doing these things that are maybe not so bad, but their whole politics, right? If we understand it as red pill, is brutal, authoritarian, exclusionary, right? They use that word democratic because they have some crazy idea of the nation as not including real, regular people, but just some, mystical idea of that nation. And want to tell people what to think rather than encourage them to learn.
Yeah. So great. I love that. So I want to dovetail that, and I want to ask you a pretty, for me, what would be a difficult question. So, I mean, it's okay if there's, kind of more opinion in it, because I mean, I think it's a really tough question to answer. So as you were talking, I was thinking of the show Mussolini, Son of the Century, which is an Italian show. It came out about last year.
I heard you praise it on a previous show.
Oh, thank you.
But I didn't get to watch it. So go
on.
Oh
my God, David, you out of all people would love it. So I'm not gonna go on a tangent about it, or off tangent about it or whatever. So point is to say, like, the best part of it was like, so in the beginning of the show, I think is very good altogether, but whatever. My favorite part is the beginning. So as people who study this, they know that he was actually a socialist initially. And so what he realized is at some point he was like, hey, well, first of all, the party kind of disowned him at some point, right? They're like, hey, you're kind of dumb. You don't really care about like the actual workers or whatever. And then at some point they figured, like, we don't really need you. You're not really doing much of anything, right? But Mussolini had this insight. He said, I don't want to quote anything because I don't remember the show exactly, but he had an insight, at least from my interpretation. And the insight seemed to be that people needed strong leaders, right? And so from that point, he decided, hey, here's like this tiny fascist party. I'm actually going to join them and I'm going to try to lead them. So what I'm pretty much saying is that the kind of insight that I got from all of that is that it sort of doesn't matter necessarily what the ideology is. So I think, and David, please, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that fascism, if you look at these elements, they're pretty like widespread. So what I mean by that is if you look at communism, if you look at the iteration of it, especially in Soviet Russia, so that can actually be construed, in my understanding, I know people would laugh at this, but that can be construed as fascism because fundamentally what communism under Marx was not that, right? So fundamentally there were supposed to be obviously workers, what do they call, co-ops, and essentially, there was fundamentally no central government, right? Whereas what developed in Soviet Russia was the antithesis of that. So you actually had totalitarianism, which I would argue in many ways is fascism, or at the very least has the elements of it. So pretty much what I'm wondering, right, is now when we're looking at, let's say, again, the iteration here of Mussolini and kind of how he built toward that and how he built toward, becoming an authoritarian dictator, right? Would it be accurate to say that if you think about fascism, that it's not an ideology per se, that more so than anything, it actually infects other ideologies, right? So it can take something like, let's say, maybe if it were to some extent socialism, right, the Nazi party, and it can infect it with this authoritarianism, nationalism, etc., which is anti-communism, right? That's not really it, and it can sort of, and it can make it its own, right? It can make it into its own monster, because if you think about it, and I'm pretty much done, this is the last thing I'll say. So communism, as iterated in Russia, was actually the antithesis again of Marxism, because communism was super racist, communism was super anti-Semitic, communism was also nationalist. If you knew any Soviet from back in that time, right, they were pretty like pro-Russia, pro-white, and then fundamentally it was obviously very exclusionary, and it was also very authoritarian, right? So what I'm wondering is if it's not that fascism is itself a separate ideology, but if it's an ideology that instead infects other ideologies. So that might be off. So, but I'm just curious.
Yeah, no, there's a lot there. It's like I catch myself saying, okay, I could go in a professorial mode, and take apart some of these particular things, and the Soviet Union, actually, it was I got, that was my first break into international politics when I was a student. I was able to study in Russia, in Moscow, in 1975.
Oh, very cool.
One of the first time, which, if you look back, was probably the high point of the Soviet Union. But but let's get to that, because again, Russian communism is super racist. Not really exactly. I mean, as we know, Putin has been attacking communism, attacking Lenin for giving formal autonomy to Ukrainians, right? To Ukraine. Ukraine should have just been part of Russia for all these times. Stupid Lenin, with communism, wanted to, right, formally build up all these different nationalities and all these different languages. But getting back to the main question about ideology, does it have it? And I think where I agree, and what the key point is that fascism, red pill politics, is always policy promiscuous, right? It will do all kinds of policies in order to retain power. So it's not totally connected. It's not libertarian by any means, like we'll stay away from the market. No, we're in charge, right? The primacy of politics. That was a big slogan of not just fascists, but fascists too in the 1930s, right? Instead of the economy deciding what's going to happen, where the stock market goes, politics, people decide, right? But sometimes fascism was protectionist. Sometimes it imposed austerity policies. Sometimes it, controlled certain industries and will have the state control it. Sometimes it's, right, well, the capitalists run the show, but they have to listen to us. Their key point, right, was, again, we're in charge. That's why I think, again, I go to red pill politics, all those different aspects of what it means. I think those are the central aspects that do not go away, right? And what we do specifically can change, right? So Mussolini, I mean, thing with Mussolini, what drove him away is that Italy was this very poor country, and they started having this idea, that they called Italy a proletarian nation. Proletarian nation, right? So they're kind of using this language of Marxism. And listeners must remember, it's language of Marxism and socialism and class struggle. In the beginning of the 20th century, everyone accepted that. That was obvious that there are big class struggles. That's what the fight about politics was all about. What are we going to do with this class struggle? Many people thought, and even some of the traditional right started thinking, nothing can be done, right? The socialists are going to win. I mean, communism is coming. We have nothing to do about it, right? The fascists, as I say, by stealing a little bits of their program, that is, say, we're not going to just ignore workers and try to shut them out, but try to incorporate them under our rule. And, instead of like socialists encouraging them to read and think for themselves, which is what all the socialists did, they have their libraries, their discussion clubs, all these things, right? Fascist parties didn't encourage the libraries and the learn for yourself and the science stuff, right? But provided some entertainment, right? Bread and circus, a little, right? We'll get you.
Well,
something.
They are Romans, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. We'll give you these games. Yeah, but policy-wise, they can change a lot, right? So it doesn't really matter. The focus is maintaining that power, maintaining all those aspects of red pill, right? And the P in red pill, right? Populist, which I, interpret in the tradition of classic American populism in the 19th century, is looking out for the little guy, right? Which, in America, right, the little guy was free and independent, but that's why the state and the society didn't have to do anything for them. Ironically, that's why America has always been more unequal than other European societies because of that myth of democracy. Everyone can do it on their own, whereas European societies, most Asian societies too, had the tradition of a law of a state, a monarchy that needs to hand things out to workers, right? And so in America we have that kind of tradition, but Trump too. We see the rhetoric, of course, in 2016 and again in the run up to this election was all kind of left-wing populist, right-wing populist, right? Because it was always, we got to kick out the immigrants, kick out the others.
Drain the swamp.
Yeah, right. That all of government is an enemy, and these private groups, or if we control them, that's okay, right? But these other things we have to, we have to get rid of.
What's crazy? That these, like, for example, let's take Trump into consideration. Like, for example, if you asked him, he would say he would claim that he's actually defending democracy against elites, kind of like that drain the swamp thing you just mentioned, right? And I guess how do we kind of arm ourselves against that kind of rhetoric, because I can imagine, like, if I had to put myself in the shoes of, let's say, someone who finds that that kind of politics appealing, they might be saying like, oh no, yeah, like Trump like, for example, Trump is for us, right? Like, he's for us,
He's one of us.
he's
Yeah.
one of us.
Yeah.
Just the thing is, yeah, like, okay, right, tariff, no tariff, tariff, no tariff, stock market up, down, like they'll have these little examples of things that are happening. Peace, no peace, peace, no peace, or weird promises of like, let's say, if I spoke to Putin, like, this would have never happened if I was the president, right?
Yeah,
So
right.
now that I am the president, we're gonna get this fixed. And then he doesn't get it fixed, and then like somebody who appeals to him will be like, well, it's more complicated than we would have originally thought, but we're gonna keep making excuses for him.
Right.
And it's very hard because they find certain aspects of his rhetoric very appealing and kind of seductive, and then kind of overlook the inadequacies. And it's like, how do you appeal to somebody like that? Like, how do you let them know that they're kind of under a spell, as far as that goes?
Look, that is a really tough question, because
Yeah.
the thing is, you ended with under a spell, right?
Yeah.
There's always in the history of politics the one thing that political scientists and sociologists can't fully understand, try as they have, is this element of charisma. Is this element, right? It's this irrational element. By irrational, I mean it's necessarily bad, but it's just not subject to reason. And for some reason or other, many people at certain times feel exceedingly close to some person, right? And, we saw that with Mussolini and Hitler and Trump. We didn't see it in other would-be fascist experiences, histories. In Hungary, they had, briefly in the pre-war period, a fascist party came to power without a very charismatic leader, right? And it didn't quite go for them, right? So, there are some people I think we cannot reach because, for whatever reason, right, their lives are wrapped up with that person, or no matter what they do, they know that he's in our side, and it'd be a real crisis to stop believing in them, right? On the other hand, look, Trump has been, I guess, right on the critics of them are like that, although it means that the economy is much worse, right? Trump has appealed to workers and non-elites. He said, I'm going to do the things for you and those big business, right? Let them do what they're good at, but I'm going to do something for you. But particularly in this second round, but somewhat in the first round too, right? He's governed entirely without any of those populist policies in place, right? All the only thing that they can say we've accomplished is cutting taxes on tips, right? Which not for everyone, and there's a certain limit. And what it's also done, there's been some research on this. It's not hard to understand that when you do that, you also get more employers taking waged workers, right, and saying, we're going to interpret you of having a job where you work on tips, right? So we don't pay you instead, right? So it's a little kind of benefit, but with the prices, with the inflation and all that, that's why he's lost such support, right? He hasn't been a good right-wing populist from his own point of view. I mean, I mentioned that I've been in Russia, but you've read the book and you cited my earlier work, right? I did most of my work in Poland, right? And I was there after, both during the communist times, but after the communist times, this movement called Solidarity came to power in 1989, and then it was very neoliberal. So in the 1990s, like, I was researching it again, it's like workers believed that there was a movement working for them called Solidarity that's going to help them all out. And then the 90s come about and they rule in this, elitist neoliberal way. Again, not 100% of the time, but enough of the time, right, that people felt that, we're just being excluded. Nothing's really happening to us. And that's where I saw this right-wing populism emerging, right? That many people can say, oh, this is very much like classic fascism, and in Poland's case, right? So you have those kinds of things. I was seeing what's happening there and saying, look, the right is going to win because the left is not doing its job. The left is not defending workers and non-elites like it has, because it wanted to bring in democracy, market-based democracy. And the left in the 80s and 90s was pretty fucked up in the sense that, it was the Clinton-esque kind of left, right? That, we'll just moderate things a little bit. We'll bring in minorities and women, represent some people more, but, we're not going to put any kind of brake on the economic on the economic system. But look, so I think a lot of people are seeing the extent of the corruption here. His poll numbers have been dropping, and that's the thing, that we can make a case to plenty of people who are interested in policy outcomes, and they move to right-wing populism, just like 100 years ago, many moved towards fascism, because the left and the liberal left weren't delivering. The fascists, one of the reasons they were able to stay in power was because they delivered some of those little benefits to workers. In Poland, that right-wing populist Jaroslaw Kaczynski and his party did a better job at first in doing that. Orban too, right? But then after a time, like in Hungary, right, Orban is empowering his own cronies, and then all the regular people who he had incorporated before are being pushed away. So right, there has to be a economic alternative for people who are not naturally sympathetic to this kind of bullish authoritarian politics. I think most people don't naturally like that. Many people will accept it if it's going to really provide things for us, right? That's what state socialism, I use that word to refer to, what you call communism, Soviet type communism, like even in Stalin's time and in Eastern Europe after World War II, right? It was absolutely authoritarian. Again, it wasn't so nationalist and racist. I'll differ with you on that, but maybe we have a separate podcast where we talk about those issues, But but it also started incorporating people, right? It taught them. I mean, communism in Eastern Europe, and even during Stalin's time, originally wasn't like super popular, but they were doing things for people, teaching them to read, providing certain benefits. Also, you had this culture that was saying that they're the fount of the nation, right? They're the salt of the earth, is that expression, right? That, dignifies people. Yeah, but, Trump policy-wise has not been doing these things. And I think we have to accept that there are going to be a group of people, right, that doesn't follow it so much and that can't leave Trump no matter what, and I think if you keep chipping away and look, they're not doing these things. They're absolutely corrupt. I mean, Trump is this poster boy for corruption. I mean, actually, no fascist leader has ever done in this kind of way. I mean, that's because Trump himself, we know he didn't come in thinking about politics, right? He had his way of thinking about himself, and he was a reality TV show. I mean, he was a celebrity. I mean, if he wasn't that and he proposed those ideas, he wouldn't have gone anywhere. If he was a new person in 2016 that people had never seen, so
So David, interesting, right, that you say that, because like I would then kind of push back on the idea that anybody was really under his spell, even though I do think it was a component of it. I don't think exactly that was it, because I think for what you're painting the picture here is, I think, super important, because it actually even translates to Ronald Reagan, even though obviously Ronald Reagan, to me, people would certainly disagree, but I disagree with them, is fascism light. So with that being said, right, I think there's the idea of A, authority, and then obviously B, like nationalism, or whatever, populism, but let's say nationalism, national identity. And I think these two things, if anything, one could argue that Trump more so exploited them, as opposed to, like, his charisma was fine. I don't think that there's anything, and look, I'm sure again people would disagree. I think that there is nothing specifically about him that makes him stand out in a way that people are like, oh my God, all reason goes out, right? I think if anything, what happens is, again, like, people prefer, again, many people, right? They prefer authority, national identity, because I think the idea is that if we're under this big umbrella, right, so a father figure or father-esque like figure is going to take care of us. And that's what I think of when I think of the elements. And I really want to get into the red pill stuff too, right? But that's what you kind of see with this, right? Whether it's the Andrew Tates of the world, I'm sure, David, you studied this, the manosphere people. It's like, it doesn't matter. People essentially look to authority figures, and they look to strongmen, right? Putin, whomever. And just as a great example of this is that, and you would definitely know this, when you look at Russia, right? So communism obviously falls apart at some point. Then you have Boris Yeltsin, right? He's kind of this putz, no offense. And then it's, right. I mean, he was a schlub, and he was also corrupt, right? So fundamentally, people are like, oh, why would we want this? This is kind of doing nothing for us. He's sort of weak. He's an alcoholic, whatever, right? But let's get Putin, right? Putin seems like he knows what he's doing. So fundamentally, what I would wonder is, what is it about people? And this is a very tough question, but what is it about people, right? That it's not necessarily, I think, fascism per se that they're drawn to, but again, it's these elements that you talk about, right? So the authority, the nationalism, right? The sense of like somebody taking care of them, somebody bringing them into their tribe, right? Somebody giving them an identity, telling them they're special, that they matter, etc., right? Because this is what like right-wing populism really is, right? It's like, hey, you'll take care of me because you fundamentally love me.
Look, great points, and thank you for pushing back, right? Because it's a good point, but I think I can look. I don't think there's historical record to say to believe that people in general just really want this strong authority. They want that strong authority when the intermediate institutions are not doing their job, right? I say generally when the left is not doing their job, but in the United States or Western Europe, that means when, right, trade unions are weak, are not able to assert themselves the way they used to, right? At that point, right, when people have their own independent institutions that they're able to affect policy and be able to get some outcomes that are good for them, then they don't just say, oh, we want this big authority here. Reagan comes into power in 1980.
80.
Right. And of course, this was the time, right? The 1970s. I'm sure you've come across this, right? All historians talk about like 1945 to 1973 or so, referred to as these golden years.
Yeah.
Right?
Especially again, after the World War II.
Yeah. In the West, and there were strong unions. There was a commitment to social democratic policy, largely because even democratic leaders after World War II, look, when the fascists were defeated in World War II, policymakers were thinking, oh, great, we defeated them, but what are we going to do to make sure that fascism doesn't catch on in 10 years? If we go back to the same kind of policies we had before, that it's only for capitalists and for elites and the workers get screwed, then again, we're going to have a left, but we're going to have fascism come back. So we have to do something about that. We have to prevent that, thwart that, by also providing some of these benefits, providing the social democracy and letting people get active for themselves, right? And so in the 1970s, late 60s and 70s, we have in America, I guess it's because, I guess hadn't thought of why, namely what I'm about to say, namely that, we think of the 60s as the time of sex, drug, and rock and roll. And of course, there was plenty of that. But it was also a time of very strong and militant unions. I remember I was a kid, I was born in 1955. So in the late 60s, I'm beginning to follow things, what's going on. I remember there were like big strikes all the time in all the major industries. I think it was 1970. I'm in New York City, and the whole post office shuts down, right? I mean, back then, of course, obviously, there's no email or anything, like the world shut down. And workers were militant, they were tough. That was happening in Great Britain too, right? All of these, they weren't looking for great authorities. They were saying, we have established such positions that we're able to handle ourselves, to represent ourselves. But what happened, and this is where Reagan began it, of course, because he entered, right, his first symbolic act, very first symbolic act was arresting the air traffic controllers and putting them in chains, right, and marching them out on a perp walk, as they call it, right? That a trade unionist is the enemy here and gave license to weaken all those. One more example, we know that in Europe, all this right-wing populism, red pill politics, proto-fascist stuff is emerging, and they all have the same enemy as the immigrant, the foreigner, and all that. Right. Well, why now? Why only in the last couple of decades? In the 1950s and 1960s, you had all these countries openly encouraging all these immigrants to come in to rebuild their war-ravaged economies, right? America wasn't destroyed physically by World War II. Much of Europe was, right? And so they brought people in, and there were millions coming in, right? When the so-called millionth guest worker or immigrant comes to Germany, right? He was feted at a train station like, oh, you're so great. We're so glad you came. There were some right-wing parties who said this is crazy, but they got no traction. Why? Because the workers who lived there, right, the native workers, right, I call them dominant essence workers, but let's not get into some of my, particular terms. The point is, right, the white workers, the so-called native French or native German, some of them were upset about it, but no one would vote for a right-wing populist authoritarian leader because we're doing fine. These others are helping rebuild our country. They're not a problem right now. It's only when globalization, right, and the rise of the others, right, that the West can no longer dominate like before. And industry, right, business is de-investing in the West and investing wherever else it can. And business after right after World War II, the capitalists were kind of condemned to making a deal with their own workers. They had no choice, right? But with globalization, developments of things like even the jumbo jet, right, emerged, I think, 1964, right? All these things enables, you could send whole factories to other places, right? You could start running things from afar. And that's when workers in the West are like, gee, we're suffering from this, and then looking for some kind of alternative. And the left was mainly anti-authoritarian. And the left in the 1960s and 70s had basically believed that, we had almost won, right? I mean, the workers, again, white workers, because that is an important definition, right? Depending on the country, the dominant group of those workers in those years after World War II probably had the best time in the history of capitalism that they ever had, right? In terms of, right, having their own institutions and standards of living going up, right? And that also, right. So my point was that in the 50s, especially the 1960s, we saw some of the left theorists started saying, the workers, they're bought into the system. They're doing so well, right? Herbert Marcuse, was like, the workers in America are part of the elite. They've made a deal with them, right? They're feeling comfortable. We have to go only with the minorities. Now, good. It's great that the left finally did make its turn to be truly universal, but it also imagined that, right, the dominant group of workers, the dominant ethnic group of workers is going to be doing well forever, right? So they didn't really, focus on that. And so it took a while. It took a while for workers who voted left, Democratic Party here, Labor Party in Britain, Social Democratic Party in Germany, all these places, to see that, well, now that left is not doing much for us. And then the immigrants suddenly become a problem, right? Suddenly, right? So it's not that they were all gravitating towards a strong leader all the time. You need to have an economy that's not performing for that dominant group, and a left that is also not doing its job and not really fighting for all workers as a class and not just for some as a group.
Mm-hmm. Then I think that kind of it's interesting because you're talking about like, okay, if the left wing is not delivering, usually that's where that shift occurs, right? From left wing parties to, right wing, right? Okay. I guess then the question is, what happened in 2020 that what was the left not delivering, or what was wrong, or maybe not wrong, but what kind of messaging do you think was kind of preventing them from securing, like from having, let's say, Kamala win 2020, sorry, not 2020, 2024. I apologize. Yeah. Yeah.
No, but look, I don't know if you meant to say 2024 all along, but I think
Yeah, I did.
2020 is, well, but I go back to 2020 because Biden wins, right? And again, there was COVID and people were fed up with Trump and he wasn't delivering and all that. And Biden comes in on what becomes a rather left economic program, right? Bernie Sanders pushed it. Again, we have to remember that thanks to what's his name, Manchin, right, in West Virginia, they have proposed bigger policies, more inclusive policies that didn't get through, but still they promoted a number of reforms that were improving things, that were providing jobs, more jobs for people, right, and had an economic program that was not so bad. The thing is, look, was Biden too old? I mean, I could say Biden too old, but Obama did this too, or rather didn't do this too. What I mean by what they didn't do is they didn't go out and publicize it every day, right? I mean, Trump understood, and kind of celebrity was that, we live in this world of attention. And of course, that's accelerated up to this moment going into who knows what that future is going to be like, right? But, Obama, again, does this incredible health care act that tens of millions of Americans who never had health care before, but we don't have recollection, right, of him kind of every day speaking to one of those people, going to their home, what exactly we've done for them, right?
Sure.
And Biden, right, has these policies and has these names. I mean, I remember telling someone else, like I was been a professor of politics, and I couldn't remember the names of the bills he passed, right? There was the CHIPS Act, Inflation Reduction Act, something else. But why were these things not household names? The president can make that if he goes out every day and says it and repeats it, because the press has to report what a president does, right? So that was one key aspect to it, right? That you didn't have someone playing that up. It was also, again, not so fully inclusive. But look, I think, Mamdani's become very popular in New York, not because, he has this great smile, which he does. And he's,
hey, Trump thinks he's hot. Thinks he's hot.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Boy. Oh, boy. Yeah. That encounter. Right.
Right.
Right. I mean, Trump couldn't believe that someone else.
He's like, oh, you're so handsome.
Yeah. But you know what Mamdani did, what no other politician had done, is that when he first went to the White House, unlike all the others who were, licking Trump's ass and, and fawning up to him, is so embarrassing when the European leaders did that at first. Not so much the cabinet leaders in America. I mean, they're hired by him, but the heads of independent states were originally doing that, right? And Obama comes there and he's talking about his program. He sort of doesn't pay attention to Trump. Like, we're going to do this. And Trump couldn't believe it. He wasn't the center of attention. So I think that's why he had to say, oh, I love you, because you're looking at this guy. I'm with him too, Yeah.
Winner's circle. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So look, those kind of, but I was going to say Mamdani, the New York mayor doesn't have a lot of possibilities, but he's got some. And he's managed to convince Kathy Hochul, the governor of New York, that, these are popular policies and, right, in providing health care and affordability stuff, all these measures. He's taken a number of concrete measures, right? And so you have some people still going out on protests. Oh, you're the worst person in the world. You're a terrible anti-Semite. They don't have a single soundbite, right, from Mamdani to justify their claim. And it's kind of falling on hollow ears, right? So, and he publicizes it, obviously, is a master at social media too. And that stuff matters. So, I think in a number of ways, Biden's policies were pushing in the right direction, but few people knew about it, right? And he wasn't this good messenger. And probably should have brought some benefits. He was always also trying to be very fair in a way that now strikes us as politically naive. And in so many of the new jobs that were created went to red states. And some of those people there, right, in those particular factories were more sympathetic to the Democrats. But, again, it didn't matter politically. And, didn't do enough, but he also didn't sell it. Mamdani is selling it how he can. And of course, you've got this guy Plattner trying to do the same. And I think he'll win. Who knows? But that kind of politics, that kind of policy, and that kind of attention and that kind of focus is, what a left politician needs to do.
Yeah, man. And so before we wrap up, I do want to ask, because we had this conversation before we started filming. So we were talking about the Knicks, obviously, for those watching, because this episode will be out today. So last night, pretty much New York City was one big block party. And so, what I'd want to know is, David, so how would you kind of understand that, you being, obviously you growing up with the Knicks, right? Because we have this sort of a central battle between the ownership class and I would say probably the rest of us, right? So where you mentioned, and I really want you to get into this, how much you hate somebody like a James Dolan, right? He's ruined the team, made it hard for fans, etc., right? But on the other hand, in some ways, I don't want to say we need him, but he's certainly a provider, because he certainly is the owner of the Knicks, right? So with that being said, right, and you would obviously could disagree, but with that being said, right, so how do we kind of understand this? Because on the one hand, we're sort of fighting against his class in many ways, but on the other hand, right, we are also supporting him at the same time while supporting the Knicks. So just curious, you can kind of get into the history of your fanhood and everything.
Yeah. Look, because I guess that contradiction became so strong that's why I stopped rooting for him, right? So I'm old enough to remember, and I was young enough to be an insane fan of the Knicks in '69. They won the first time in '69, right? I'm like 12 or 13, the perfect age to be like, oh my God, that's all that could be, right? My mother used to remind me, I ran on the court after one game and Willis Reed and Walt Frazier gave me 5, and I told my mother, and even when I was an adult, she would bring it up. Oh, I remember you came home and it's like Willis Reed gave me 5, so I was this super fan. We were able to get, now we hear this insane price of the seats, right? Back then, it wasn't the same sport, right? Being a student, I was a junior high school student. We got a GO card, general organization, entitled us to buy Knicks seats in the bleachers for $3. I was fanatic, right? And I was, supporting them and then continuing for a long time. 1999 is not just the time that the Knicks lost the last chance that they were in the finals, but it's also when Dolan bought the team, right? And over time, he's become such a fucking scumbag, right? I mean, not just throwing Oakley out of the arena, but we've read about this. He's got these cameras like it's China, these face recognition cameras to keep people out. This utter discipline. So, and he was providing shit teams because New York people will still go to the Garden. So I said, fuck it, right? I'm through with the Knicks. I'm like actively rooting against them. So it's been a big problem lately because it's like, yeah, they hate them, don't want them to win, but they got an entertaining team. And my daughter's in New York. I can see she's so excited. She's 26. She never experienced anything like this. New York's so different than it used to be. It's like amazing. So, look, Dolan, I mean, there are some teams, I don't know if it's still the case, but Green Bay and the Green Bay Packers.
Owned by the fucking city. Yup, owned by the people.
There you go.
Yup. I knew you were going to say that. Yup.
Yes. And, it's possible in New York. There are some European soccer teams, football teams, right, that are run the same way. So we don't need these guys to do it. I mean, Dolan most of the time put out a shit team. And I must admit, I got a little kind of, tired of New Yorkers who kept going and buying their tickets, when they sucked. And I realized, right, Dolan is shitting, on a cash cow, no matter what he does, and so, yeah, look, right, there is this big clash, right? I could root for the Knicks, this Jalen Brunson. I mean, I just watched him like the rest of us, kind of unbelievable, right?
And he's, by the way, he's the ultimate socialist, man. He gave up a ton of money to help build a team around him. So, yeah.
I know, I read that. That was unbelievable.
Yeah.
But it's also sickening that he had to give that money up. Does Dolan give money up?
Right.
I actually hate all this stuff when people say sports members are making a lot of money. Do they know how much, the owner is getting? If they don't make it, that's just going to the owner. That is just sick, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, look, I could see a political movement now using the example of Jalen Dolan giving up money for the collective and saying, no, we shouldn't be giving up money for Dolan, and we're not going to be doing that. But if we have, collective ownership, I wouldn't be surprised if Mamdani puts that forward at some time, at some point, or others are going to. Look, these kind of democratic socialist policies, when they have teeth, when they're implemented, when they're realized, right, lure a lot of people. Again, that's why the world was so stable after 1945. It wasn't just people are tired of fascism. No, right. You had a conscious move. You had a strong left to actually implement these things. And again, you had business that's one last, kind of academic, well, not academic, but political point. After 1945, it was in business's interest too to have a healthier working class, a better trained working class. So, right. Those golden years were when capitalists got super big too. Yeah. Nowadays, that's the big problem for the left, right? It's not just that the left doesn't have militant slogans. The real objective problem is that you don't have business capitalists who see any interest in making a deal with that left, right? That's why when I was a kid, I was also, I was anti-American politics. I didn't like Soviet politics either. I went there as a young person, but I was, critical of that. I was started moving towards, Trotskyism, which was like a pox on both of your houses, right? And I lost my train of thinking.
So let me add this. So interestingly enough, right? I mean, not to get into this obviously that much, but okay, the sort of the power, because you mentioned, that you pretty much said something about exploitation and just like, it's a cash cow for him, right? So this makes me think of the '87 NFL strike, which before I was born, but whatever, I know a decent amount about it. And so, they obviously brought in replacement players. If anybody's seen the Keanu Reeves movie, The Replacements, that's based on the '87 strike, whatever. But point is to say they realized that they were not going to lose any fans, which is so fucked up, because what that tells you is that like sort of exploitation is built into the system. Because you have power, just knowing that people love sports, they need sports, whatever, right? You actually don't need the stars as much as you thought you did. And to me, that's the most fucked up thing, because like fundamentally, whatever your salary cap is, I mean, at the end of the day, you have full control. So it's like, this is why you can easily trade players, release them, whatever, right? Because at the end of the day, for the most part, maybe not the entire fan base, obviously, because obviously, people kind of to come and go, right? But that core fan base, like what you need to maintain your own sort of privilege or whatever your status, that's not fundamentally going away. Yeah, man. So for somebody like a James Dolan, I mean, great that he did it, but he really doesn't have that much incentive to provide like a championship caliber team.
Right.
I mean, at the end of the day, right, whether it's shit or whether it's not, his status, his tier on the whatever political social system, that's not going away.
Yeah, look, you're right. Right. He's got no interest in doing it. And the replacement, I hadn't thought of that in a while. Right. Of course, I think it's a little easier in football because they wear the helmets,
Yeah,
so you don't
true.
really see them as much as in basketball. And one player in basketball makes a huge difference that one player in football can't do. But still, you're exactly right. Right. That they strive towards replaceability. Look, that's been a big aim of capitalism, is not just to exploit workers, but to take away their autonomy, right? To take away their ability to control the workforce, right? That's why capitalism is so unpopular among artisans, among craftsmen, right? Because we're in control of our labor, we're in control of what we do, but now we have factory labor and discipline and the Taylorism that emerges in the 20th century. They want to take away our autonomy, right? So and that's a human right, is, I think, right, to be autonomous, to be able to control what you do, your own life. And, that's what's so crucial, right? And, that's where, again, the left can provide an alternative. And by the way, I remember what I was saying. It was just that same point that, right, nowadays, the business doesn't have as much of an incentive to do it. Oh, and so what I think is going to happen, because I was a democratic critic of communist society, right, opposing them in the name of, social democracy, I guess, really, democratic socialism. But I think what's going to happen now is that when there seems to be the left not really being able, if it's not able to really discipline capital, that you're going to see a rise again of a Leninist left, of a more militant left. We haven't seen that, right? People talk about communism, but again, there haven't been communists on the scene for a few decades, right? This is basically the first time in history we live in a world where there are fascists, but no communists, right? And what I mean by that, communists who say, we're going to take state power and hold it and make sure the capitalists get in this non-democratic way, right? And, and it's good that that's disappeared among the left. But if there's no chance for these corrective policies, social democratic, pro-leftist, pro-worker policies to be introduced, then you're going to get, and you already see, right, some leftists who say, well, then fuck the whole thing, right? Yeah. We've got to go in that more militant direction, and I do think that's going to emerge.
That's interesting. I guess I would then, I wanted to ask you this question. If you were, let's say, advising center-left Democratic parties today, what would you tell them to do that they must do differently in order to connect with voters? Yeah.
Yeah, look, speak constantly around these economic issues. Do not sacrifice on identity politics, right? I mean, we're all workers, we're all people, we're all of the same group, right? That today is a leftist idea because the red pill movement, whether it's fascism or right-wing populism, rejects that, right? So we can stand for people as a class, right? And as a wide group, right? The Occupy movement started talking about the 99%, not a bad slogan, although probably it's not really 99%, but that's another point, but to actually do what you can to implement these policies, and it's populist policies, economically populist policies that provide more security and more autonomy to people can be provided, empower unions, have them speak to themselves, speak about these issues constantly, right? Every day, talk about them as the central ones, and where you have any kind of power, implement them, right? Be consistent on these kind of issues, and don't sacrifice. Don't go back to, oh no, we have to just, right, forget about this identity politics, because identity politics is, I mean, I'm sorry I even used the term, right? I mean, it's a matter of basic democracy, that if you're born as a human being, you're an equal human being, that you do naturally and need to have the same rights and chances as everyone else. Point, end of story. Don't apologize for it, right? But we're working for everyone, working on everyone's behalf and bolstering those, right, who are being exploited and are having a harder time. I mean, and that's what left politics is about, right? Be consistent on those kinds of things. And we know there's a lot of support for it, not just Mamdani appearing basically out of nowhere, but if you recall, Bernie Sanders essentially appeared out of nowhere. People, even he thought he didn't have a chance. If he thought he had a chance, he probably could have won in 2016 nomination, but he didn't think he had a chance. But there's all this desire for that, right? So you got to get rid of that kind of pro-capitalist, pro-market, pro-globalization mainstream without demonizing others, right? And implement those kind of policies. And they're going to be snags. It's not going to always work all the time, but so what? People are aware that people make mistakes, right? If you're consistent and if you're authentic, right, and people see that you really mean it, well, they're going to support you too. But again, it's not just supporting the leader. The leader also has to encourage those movements, right? Obama had built a big movement in 2016, but then it let it fall apart. And Mamdani, actually, I'm not sure what's happening there as far as the social movements, from New York, but I haven't lived there in a while. But, I'm going there next week, and I'm going to ask around those questions from some people who know. Do those movements who were out there canvassing for Mamdani, are they still there? Because we need them. We need them to push him and to push any potential left politics from below.
I love it. And David, man, the point that you made about whatever, let's say militarized the militant version of communism, that's probably one of the most profound points we had on the show. I've literally never even thought about it. So because I think a lot of us, even though I'm obviously kind of more into the politics or whatever, I think for a lot of us, when we see kind of Bernie Sanders or, kind of democratic socialism, we don't necessarily like differentiate it from communism. Not to say that like anybody ever thought about it as the same thing, but I think we don't actually go deeper into it. We just kind of like zero in on it. So I think you make such a great point that it's like if we reject the Bernie Sanders, the AOCs, etc., what's essentially going to happen, and obviously if they don't push hard enough either, right? But what's essentially going to happen is you're going to get this like kind of Leninist, maybe even Stalinist, right, to go further version of communism, right? That's so great. I never even thought of that, because my thinking is, again, just zero in, okay, democratic socialists, like this is sort of what we need to do, etc. And yeah, you don't think about like kind of what the consequences are, the repercussions if they don't do enough. So
yeah, just like I wrote this book, right, about this new form, a kind of revival of fascism in a new form, but still being red pill politics, right? People don't understand the difference, right, between communism and this democratic socialism, right? And I wrote this book on the right, but as you mentioned, my previous books were about the communist left. My first book was about how solidarity won, right? I mean, I was living in Poland during martial law, during the communist system, and I was opposed to that, right? Very critical of that, right? And then it got pushed aside. And right, the left was dominating for a while, a liberal left, but as it's not being able to get the job done, then you get this radical right emerging, and absolutely, right, there's going to be that return of that. So I think we could have a good discussion, on communism too, whether in another podcast, which would be great, or call me up and we'll have a conversation on our own.
I love it. Good. Oh man, that's such a great endpoint too. Okay, Alan, final questions for David before we wrap up, man.
Oh, right. If we wanted to follow you, follow your work, and of course buy the book, where can we?
Oh, and let me just add, and also any upcoming appearances you might have for the book.
Yeah, some other podcasts. Right now I'm doing podcasts. I guess I'll be honest. Look, The book came out just now at a time where books are not the same thing that books were 10 or 15 years ago,
Yep.
right? My publisher is not paying for book tours. And, I'm known in Poland because I've written a lot about that. Like I have a interview in Newsweek Poland coming out next week. But, I'm someone who's known writing about East European politics. So, frankly, I mean, I can't lie. I'm not getting that publicity, which it's not really just for myself. I mean, of course, that's nice to get it, but I'm talking about really crucial points, I think, of how to, what the left needs to do. And I don't have a lot of, public appearances coming up. So I guess if your listeners want to invite me to a book club, to a bookstore, to a university talk, I'm very open to that because I want to talk about these kinds of ideas. I'm even so behind. I was just working on that book that, I don't have an active web page. Your last question, I've got scheduled to talk with someone, but yeah, look, I'm old school in that way. I'm trying to, I'm healthy and active, and I got a lot of energy, so I think I'll push in that direction because these days the book itself is not going to get out there more. So I encourage you and your listeners to help this cause, and I'll talk about it, and I'll do my own part by trying to get more media savvy.
I love it, David, man. Thank you so much for going on. This was such an excellent episode.
Yeah, thanks. Well, you guys are great to talk to. It's a real just easy talk. We could be hanging out in a bar or in a living room. It's great. Thank you.
Absolutely. You're very welcome, man. We'll talk to you soon.
Take care.
See ya. Take care. Bye.
All right. That was cool. So, everyone, of course, as you know, you can follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and on Instagram. On X, we're at Seize_podcast. Like, subscribe, hit the bell on YouTube. And again, thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.